Hello everyone, today we come back to our beloved Longobirds and we discuss an interesting aspect of the settlement, fundamentally the invasion, the foundation of the kingdom. I know that I'm talking a lot about this stuff because I somehow started this series now and we go in chronological order. I've already discussed the stuff to a general degree, but this is more in depth, like to specific topics, right? And as you read from the title here, we will essentially challenge at different levels the myth, right, of the total fracture, right, of Longobard Italy from the latter's Roman past, right, which is actually a pretty renowned concept historiographically in the most updated academic acquisitions. But if you think about it, it's very intuitive also, and especially if you know the rest, right, of the Italian Middle Ages, which admittedly it's not something that people seem to know, be particularly knowledgeable of it, but it's just from starting from these topics that you realize that, and I say it without any modesty, that yes, on YouTube there is nothing on the Longobards. Right, nothing acceptable, nothing researched, nothing coming from actual, competent sources, or, and or handled by people who understand the ones that, of course, exist out there. So these topics require, of course, some background, some context, whatever. So there are also long videos exactly for this reason. I do not make this stuff for entertainment. I do it for, say, educational purposes and also for fun, to the degree of, say, that can be achieved through it, because it is satisfying when you actually get it, but in order to do it, it takes time and effort, which doesn't seem something that people are particularly inclined nowadays to, to provide from themselves. And I understand that, but at least, say, stop talking about these topics at the same time, because we have really a lot being written and studied on this stuff, and the level of radical popular ignorance nowadays in basically any historical topic is really appalling, right? There is something there that is obviously getting down to the macroscopic and traumatic shortcoming of people under any moral, cultural, and personal point of view. In any case, this aspect of the fracture is something you would hear also from moderately aware people on this topic, right? This is a theme that, of course, is deeply connected, as we will see now, with the let's say the destiny of the elites, right? The end of the fiscus, right? But it's never quite as simple as it sounds, right? We must understand exactly the references, and I think that starting, in fact, from the sources, which are the theology of Gregory the Great and the Historia Longobardorum of Paul the Deacon, tells a lot, right? Because one thing that at least it's relatively known about this period is that we know a very few. Right, Italy is not even one of the least documented places ever, but definitely this was a critical time, one of change, right? It doesn't mean, however, that what occurred was essentially the apocalypse that was described by sources that were either from the other side or that wrote on the basis, even if people were informed of these matters from at the time, that however wrote, collected this info from centuries apart. That's why I quote these two authors, right? So it is really common to think that the impact of the Longobards in Italy was presented in terms that only euphemistically could be defined as negative, right? And the reason being exactly the apocalyptic register that we get from some sources, of the time that, however, were so big, such as Gregory the Great, one of the single most important figures in the history of mankind, and I hope that you have the palest idea of why that was the case, but that were in fact coming out of a specific context. In his book of the Dialogy, Gregory the Great, that was Pope between 509 and 604, thus in the first decades, just after the arrival of the Longobards in Italy, presents us the fearsome nocturnal vision of the Bishop Redemptus of Ferentinus in Upper Lazio, about which I made a video just recently. And this bishop, while sleeping in the church of the martyr Eutychus, has a dream, a nightmare, in which a voice told him that finis venit universa carnis, right? So this is the end of the world, the end of all flesh, right? So the taking over, finally, of Christ, the transfiguration of the world, and the reunion with the One. That's, however, as you know, in the eschatological tradition, basically the entire universal religion is, of course, a positive event, but that it is accompanied by a prior clash that, say, in Christian terms, is confidently about, like, we will, just by fate, know that we will make it, right? The gates of hell shall not prevail against her, the church. But that would occur not before a temporary rule of the Antichrist, or at least this mega clash that would have occurred between the forces of good and the one of evil, right? From which, hopefully, of course, God would emerge triumphant, thanks to the spirit, right, of Christendom in this case. But it was the same identical idea. It's the storming of the Asgard that, in that regard, will tell us something darker, right, with losses among the Aesir, etc. But let's say Christianity was more confident, at least, in the fact that victory would literally, as the Holy Ghost, prevail, right? This didn't take out so simply the necessity of the struggle, right? Because, of course, in the Christian message, everything is pretty clear about the war that needs to be fought as well. So I will not digress in this just difference of degree that exists from, say, the so-called pagan religion. But it's really the same thing. The anecdote here is that, according to Gregory, while Redemptus was trying to pray, to exorcise in some way this nefarious dream, terrible signs appeared in the sky. This was not a dream, right? The bishop saw flaming spears. And Gregory sadly comments, quote, shortly afterwards, the wild people of the Longobards came out of their native land, infuriated over our heads. And the consequences, he continues, are under everybody's eyes. The populated cities, churches, and monasteries destroyed, deserted countryside in the hands of ferocious beasts, right? And this would have been, in fact, the beginning of the end of the world, right? I made, well, admittedly, I didn't make enough videos about Gregory the Great, but here there is a very specific, say, ideological concept that is instrumental for a very specific, say, aspect of, say, even the rise of what was effectively the papal spiritual preeminence over Western Christendom that I cannot digress on. In any case, for what we hear now, the Longobards were pictured like this. You know what was the Pope's position here? He was formerly within the Roman Empire, of which Rome was always unavoidably the capital. Doesn't matter which others were more powerful as centers of government or whatever. You must reflect on why this was seen as the end of the world. Why these wolves, as real Ulfatnars in the case of the Longobards, were roaming around the sacred citadel of heaven, right? According to the end time age of the wolf, specifically. So here, obviously, the concept you can guess was a concited call, right, to cohesion, to, say, spiritual soundness, right, and general warning of what was the actual hierarchy of the world. Now, the theology of Gregory the Great, as again one of the greatest sources in the history of the Middle Ages, to say the least, or in the history of the world, that simply had an enormous impact on our perception of those times, because the Longobards didn't write yet, or even if they did, in the moment, of course, they installed themselves in Italy. We have a very few from the first decades, the most tumultuous ones, as we will see, and we already know, so that even a few sources during the early Middle Ages can, generally speaking, direct the emotional tension, right, in the way we approach these topics in the first place, right? So if we were to base ourselves solely on the theology, and we will see that there are actually other sources, and that's why scientifically we can't do this just, with this specific one, is, however, to theorize a total fracture from the previous and posterior time to 568, 569, the date of the larger Longobard invasion of Italy. Right, and there was a famous Italian medievalist called Tabacco, who is very famous in continental Europe, who provided with a very definitive kind of description regarding the Longobard invasion as properly a definitive break in the history of Italy. Tabacco was actually a great historian, and he was referring in that work specifically about the end of the great senatorial aristocracy that, from a millennium at the head of Italy and capable of conditioning at all levels the internal relations, both for their nature of great landowners' estates and for the privileged holder of the great patrimony of ancient culture. Right, I made a video about the Romano-Italic aristocracy that notoriously by the 5th, the 6th century was violently more cultured, educated, developed than the Byzantine one. Notoriously, it came from a very different background, right? And in this, never underestimate even, and especially through this video, as we will see, what this actually meant in a general sense. This could be said of the Gallic, the Gallo-Roman one, in part also about the Hispanic, but the idea that there is a Latin Germanic world, right, that is the one from which eventually our narrower sense of Western civilization emerged, and that Constantinople somehow lagged behind at a point, right? But for the very not just the formamentous, but the same organization of their community, right? This is quite important. And Tabacco was right in as much as this time, this big millennium, was over, right? This great senators as the holders of a literary culture, but also of culture as a capacity of governing a complex world, right? The one that now had been evidently shrinking, not just in the traumatized Italy after the Gothic War, but you can argue across the entire Eurasia, right? Here, the great classical world was shrinking, and everything around together with it, right? This is what we do not picture that much. It was a tragedy of global scale. Nobody really benefited in an absolute sense from this, right? Not even those who succeeded in maintaining control, such as the Longobards and other peoples that kept working, of course, with the Roman world, as we will see now. Now, the main source, as much as the most immediate one of reference on the fate of these senators, is represented, just to say how few we actually know in documentary terms, by two passages of Paul the Deacon, right, that have been dramatically criticized from a historical point of view, and that, according to himself, were drawn as informations from the brief story, what Paul calls the Historiola in Latin, so really a diminutive of history, of the abbot Secundus of Non, the Non Valley, northern Italy, who lived exactly between the end of the 6th and the beginning of the 7th century. Not only, but who was also very tied to the Longobard court of Pavia. So the man that you would have liked, we do not know the history of this guy, right? He was known in Paul the Deacon's times, but as many sources, unfortunately, went lost, right? So we would, when you study early medieval Europe from the actual sources, you realize how the universe that exists, if you just scratch a little bit beneath the surface for the few that you can find regarding to, and realizing how many other sources, how much was actually produced at the time that unfortunately we also do not have anymore, right? The witness of Secundus was very close to the events of the Longobard invasion, while instead Paul the Deacon wrote after 2 centuries of the same event. In the first passage, Paul writes that when Alboin died in 572 and he was succeeded on the Longobard throne by Clef, in the 2 years in which the latter reigned, he, quote, killed with the sword or threw out of Italy many powerful Romans. So essentially elite Romans. While in the second passage, he says that during the decade in which the Longobard dukes went on without a king, so we're talking about 574, 584, quote, many noble Romans were killed for greed. Right? This is, believe it or not, right, in explicit terms, basically from the Longobard side, from the Italian side, I'd say the only thing that we know about this, right, in explicit terms, right. So the concept here was that in the years following the conquest, this powerful estate of Roman senators would have essentially been wiped out forever, dragging together with them all the fundamental structures of the Italic society, of late antique matrix, down. As a consequence, the peninsula, aside from the Longobards and the Byzantine presence, the latter as a foreign force essentially, was devoid of any other guidance with local roots, right? So this picture, as you understand, is doesn't make much sense for a number of reasons. Just in practical terms, a country like Italy that had at that point 4 or 5 million of inhabitants just hosted some of it. Doesn't matter how hardly it had been by the war, like was and remained the most urbanized, the most per capita wealthy, the most generally speaking also somehow civilly functional country in Western Europe, right? You cannot argue that urban government, individual literacy, trade dynamism were, let's say, bigger overall, qualitatively speaking, in places like Gaul or Spain, right? This is not to say that these were not powerful, advanced places. Actually, and we know that, of course, Italy was fragmented in this process, but say in the Merovingians, for example, were the largest power in Europe. The Visigoths were also unitarily bigger than the Longobards at this point, at least. But in terms of, like, this is the point that we do not get documented explicitly, but that we will observe now. So this is stratum. Right, this is not a matter of kings, of individual powerful elites. This is exactly what in Italy, as we've seen, according to these sources, had been taken out, right? But in the very elite sense of it, right? The other institutions, as we will see, the church, other landowners, etc., were still there, and they were not few, and they were not, say, brutalized apparently by this, because we do not have evidence of it. Right, so in places like Gaul, as we will see, as people come here often on this kind of videos and say, the Romans were so evil because they had high taxation. Instead, finally the heroically tribalistic Longobards arrived, and they were such great heroes because they crushed the Romans. Yeah, if I don't know, the Franks in Gaul maintain exactly the same Roman form of taxation. The Visigoths did the same, right? So the point here is not the fact that here a culture was, competing against one another. This was about making things work, right? And describing how they functionally did, because it turned out that the Longobard kingdom was founded on an incredibly solid basis, right? And so and that didn't have the problems of the Merovingians that killed one another, break children's hands on rocks because they were the children of your brother, that had the blood of the dynasty that controlled an enormous amount of territory because the power was concentrated just in the hands of few people. You don't have the Visigoths that collapse all of a sudden by the time of the Arab invasion. There is and together with all the structures, the future of the Longobard kingdom, what would become this Halak kingdom, is something incredibly different. And it must be explained in the moment in which the Longobards founded their own power in the peninsula. Right? So one must be extremely careful about this kind of mechanism. So even in reference of the darkest times, for example, the so-called decade of ducal anarchy that we looked at before, many signals, and we will talk just about these first generations, right, that allegedly would have been the total mess of complete fracture and break and erasing of Roman culture, of the Romans, whatever, that this, again, a devastating picture, right, is to be historically rejected. And on the contrary, we see a very big deal of continuity with the pre-invasion situation. With some changes that were for the better, the Longobards did confer to some of these exhausted lands a better life, and we will see the reason why specifically, which is commonly never thought. Like, there is this kind of structuralistic, materialistic idea. There is a way of Germanic government and a way of Roman government. It completely decontextualized from any region, from any population, from any wealth distribution. It's just about this obsessive 19th century fourth estate or nationalist and or socialist deterministic and relativistic delusion that people fundamentally are as stupid as those who actually believe these things. First of all, during this decade of anarchy, the St. Paul the Deacon tells us that basically the regions that Alboin had conquered, that is, northern Italy at large, were practically devoid of violence. Right? This is obvious. The Longobards had settled there, and what kind of benefit they would have gotten from carrying out violence or damage or distractions or whatever, nobody really knows. So it was likely central Italy that suffered the greater damage, right? Because as we've seen in many other videos about the Longobard settlement, you know that it was this corridor that connected Rome with Ravenna just across the Apennines. It was very tough terrain. The Longobards were without a single leader, so they went in single packs led by dukes who settled as lords in here, there, but like as a kind of leopard skin pattern, right? So as you can see even from the pictures that I post here while I talk about Longobard Italy normally. So this central Italian region was naturally a sort of war zone, right? Not entirely, because of course there could be war bands who passed here and there, but it lasted for a given time, right? And still the system worked also for the Longobards immediately on the same basis of the cities. They installed themselves there, they began to rule from there, and of course they wouldn't destroy the same places around them unless the Byzantines came to raid and do that against the Longobards and vice versa, right? So those were definitely the eras we know at different times of open war between authority, also other Longobards who had remained faithful Byzantine federati in Italy, and we will see this later, by the way. But there is no trace of a, say, general, like the pattern of the Longobard conquest was violent, because the purpose of the conquest was essentially using violence to displace, other than the resistance that the Byzantine pockets, remember there was no field army here, would have carried out. We've seen just in the last video that there were some Byzantine garrisons that also remained isolated, surrounded by the Longobards, and essentially coexisting with them, and there is no trace of violence. There's trade, there is this eventual end, like they thought that at some point the empire would have struck back, but they wouldn't. So they would become eventually Longobards, paradoxically, in those same places. Think about the island of the Como Lake. That's with the Byzantine leader Francia. That's the most famous, right, episode. But you can imagine many others happening at the same time, right? Another major tracer of this continuity that we are essentially affirming historiographically are the other, let's say, aristocracies of some kind, that is to say, the church, right? When Paul the Deacon speaks of the powerful Romans, obviously he is referring to the senators, like lay rulers, right? Who had remained in charge of the civilian affairs throughout all the Gothic times, and that were effectively the landowners, those who controlled the majority of the population in Italy all throughout, right? The church, and this is true especially for Italy, was not militarized, right? The Italian church was more, again, urban, civilized, generally speaking, framed within this safer pattern. You see, of course, the peninsula had suffered invasions, raids, whatever, but this had never been really a frontier area, right? The boundaries of Italy are very precise. Even the loots, think about the sacks of Rome, but normally they were quite disciplined in the way they operated, right? They took a lot of wealth, right? They literally collected it, harvested it, and shipped it somewhere else, or things like that. There was violence, there were invasions, things like that, but the entire system had not been shattered historically, if not properly by the Gothic War. It was actually a war of defense of Italy from the Byzantines at that point. And I made a video specifically about the history of Rome and the Latin Gothic resistance to the Byzantines, right? Always remember this. You cannot talk about the Roman Empire as a sort of monad where there are some abstract Romans that leave without distinction. By the time of Belisarius, the Byzantines were essentially seen as foreign invaders by the Italian population, not just by the Goths or the common people, but by the same senatorial elite that in part would flee to Constantinople, that in part had been the very ones who had called for the reintegration of Italy under properly the imperial control, but that just wanted actually to preserve a sort of decentralized position. It's still a florid, decadent empire, and that shipwrecked the entire thing with essentially the Gothic War being, say, it was not just their fault, but at least they called for it, and that the Byzantine command screwed up. There was the Gothic uprising, and after the first conquest, and so armies making back and forth across the peninsula 2 or 3 times. That's what effectively damaged Italy to a structural point that we can observe, especially from a social point of view, because the senators fled. And the reason is obvious. It's something that happened also in it happened in Britain before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. This is a parallelism with Longobard history. It wasn't the Germans who made the thing. It was essentially the war who followed in the moment in which the land was without a hand, or at least was witnessing the most obvious thing, that the senators had been from the side of the invaders, and so if you took over their land, you could essentially retake your own country, right, and rule in it as you would have liked to do it on your own, right? And so even a destruction of what? Well, of course, the war was quite devastating and brutal, and Italy went depopulated also because of the pandemic and all the general instability that had followed because of the war, etc. But the lands remained there. The possibility also of working them remained there, and what really ceased there was the fiscus, right? For reasons that were not just the sudden end of paying taxes. This is not what happened, right? But this is the core point of the video, as we will see now. But paying taxes to a foreign power. This is the single most important aspect of the war. When the Longobards settle, we do not have evidence of the Roman fiscus working, but it's not because the Longobards simply sat there and say, okay, well, there is a lot to say to get from this land, but I will not tax them because I don't know why. No. What concretely happened, in spite of the depletion of the Italian resources and all this stuff, was essentially that the Longobard Duke, who settled in a Roman city that was fundamentally the center of a district, was a see of a diocese, whatever, would starting to rule there as a lord in this provincial dimension, and the wealth that he could get from this district would essentially remain in the district largely. Right, the Longobard kings would try to, of course, to create, also to some degree of success, a way that would cash more of this, also substituting the dukes with the vassals in many instances and so on. But definitely not a mega racket system for making the Byzantines from Constantinople, taking still the large latifundia cannons of the Italian countryside and shipping it away to Constantinople, right? This is what effectively ended. The Roman fiscus was functional to that imperial international, right, transcontinental almost dimension, right? At this point, maintaining that would have been just, first of all, extremely costly, but also it would have been useless because those who ruled in the peninsula were the ones who would make the same fruits of the peninsula there, right? And this is actually the entire point here that we will observe, right? The church is crucial to understand this because the church was fairly rich as well. And when we look at the ecclesiastical elites, this catastrophistic, apocalyptic kind of idea that the Longobards arrived and everything collapsed, whatever, the break with Roman culture, with the previous institution, simply doesn't have any consistency. There were problems, but the only, for example, escapes from their own see of bishops of the Po Valley, for example, that are witnessed with certainty are two. Now, I will like to stress that the Po Valley had some of the largest cities of the entire empire still functional at the time, and it was, generally speaking, heavily urbanized for, say, European Mediterranean standards. The first instance happened on the Eastern Front, right, where the clash between the Longobards and the Byzantines dragged on for decades, right? Because the Byzantines mostly replenished their forces from the Adriatic, from Ravenna, and so you have in the northeast of Italy most of the frontier areas from which the empire could interfere in the Longobard settlement. The first escape, again, is the case of the Patriarch of Aquileia, Elias, that in 579 took refuge in Grado. That's just very close, by the way, to Aquileia. And there were two parallel bishops, basically, throughout this time, like a Longobard one and Byzantine from the other, right? So even the discontinuity, the break here, doesn't seem particularly big. But the second one is the one of the Archbishop of Milan, Constantius, that took refuge in Genoa, right? And Milan was quite big and important, so this guy was also likely somebody really belonging to a high elite of some sort. So we know only of these two instances, right? There were some excellent escapes because, of course, these were some of the most important prelates of northern Italy. The only bishops, by the way, of which we can presume with a certain security the senatorial, or again, still very high social level origin. The two seats remain devoid of bishop, but not of clergy. For decades, this is an interesting aspect too, but the most important thing here is that the head is away, but the church, the clergy, is there. It remains throughout all these most turbulent times of war, right, that occur at the end of the 6th century. So in other words, the local clergymen we see at large remain exactly where they are, right? The bishops remain at their place, also in the other seats, as far as we understand, albeit the absence of sources, as always, is not given us clarity, for example, on the role that they carried out in this historical phase of the end of the 6th century. There are, however, some examples that present us the bishops as interlocutors with the Longobards, right, from a very early age, from the moment of the invasion itself. Very famously, the episode of the Bishop Felix of Treviso, who literally went to meet Alboin during his advance across northeastern Italy, and who confirmed Felix's possessions of his own church, right? This is Paul the Deacon telling us that it happened through a solemn written document, this is of incredible importance, right? The fact that Alboin was, like, he could behave like, I don't know, a medieval Holy Roman Emperor, right? He marched into Italy. Here they had just entered, right? And this bishop meets with him, and Alboin basically writes down, or has, of course, himself written down, that the property of the Trevisan church would remain to the local diocese, right? And of course, very likely, was not just the case of the Church of Treviso, right? This, in general, is valid for other places, but also for the inhabitants. Because what do you have to gain by installing into this land that has still all the, essentially, the infrastructural means? We'll see now the crucial problem of the land to probably in the same way that they had negotiated with Saint Byzantines, right? I've never made a video about this topic, but it's likely true that the Longobards had negotiated this settlement. Of course, it's true that the Longobards simply seized what they wanted, but still the means, this is the very important thing, through which this happened may have as well been through the usual Roman hospitalitas that entailed very precise and orderly forms of settlement. Whether the Longobards just respected this or not, especially in the frontier areas, is another story. But generally speaking, the interaction with this local population, it was not a few, right? It was the obvious majority. Even after the full settlement of the Longobard, and by far, right? So these were the people who worked, essentially, who knew how the entire system had been kept working. Again, the idea of the apocalypse, that these cities had basically collapsed, that, there were, people crawling, sprawling dead all around. Like, there is no such thing concretely documented. Systems get a lot of damage, but they still stand, right? I think that the case of the especially of urban culture in Italy is quite evident from an archaeological and epigraphical point of view. I mean, the idea that there was a continuity between the guilds, the sense, like they're the same families in great part, of the sense of municipal pride, and there are, in fact, also in Longobard times, city militias that are quite like the ancestors of the communal armies of the later centuries. It's quite obvious, right? We do not get any evidence of the catastrophic picture outside of the obvious shrinking of the population, of the agricultural output, things like that, but not of the, simply the simple elimination of the world that existed before. That was one of the single most Roman, Catholic, again, urbanized, literate, and still prosper, right? This is something that is never stressed enough, right? That coming from Central Europe, right? The Longobards obviously saw Italy as a pretty rich place, and technically, yes, it still was, right? The fact that it was a devastating war doesn't mean that all of a sudden this place was actually a desert, right? If you have ever heard of this, it's because probably you have read, or say you have heard someone that was hearing someone commenting on Gregory the Great's theology that were obviously hyperbolic and apocalyptic on purpose, not for lying, not because there is a conspiracy theory of some evil power that wants you personally not to know what happened historically, but because there's a very specific historical context for which that work was needed. Don't think that you're so important, right, 1,500 years later, because you're just not, right? And that's also why many people want to believe things that are not actually true, because they think that they're somehow relevant in the equation. So Treviso, for example, entered peacefully under the Longobard dominion, right? And this was the case for many, and if not most, of the cities here involved. We do not have news of any siege warfare, for example. The Longobards settled in northern Italy, and aside from that this was really made up because there is no other proof from any other source, archaeological documentary like that. This came from a later history that said that Pavia was besieged for 3 years by Longobards before being occupied. Well, there is actually no other evidence, and it turns out this was essentially copying the story of Theodoric besieging Ravenna with Odoacer inside for 3 years. So that's the Longobards, the Great Alban, had to compare, right, with Theodoric the Great, right? But there is no actual evidence of that. About 20 years later, the bishops Agnellus of Trent and Ingenuinus of Sabiona also operated as intermediaries between the Franks that had, at that point from the north, invaded the Trento area, and the defenders of the rock, the stronghold of Ferrugia, close to Trent, obtaining for them the possibility of ransom, even though at a very high price, from 600 golden solidi a person, right? So this is an incredibly telling story, because may there be an exaggeration about the wealth involved here? Well, the fact that we know of this is still an indicator that this, frankly, peripheral area, because the Trento one it's not Milan, right? It's not some of the largest centers in the north. Here it's just a frontier quarrel between the Franks that every once in a while send some war band to harass, in this case the newly settled Longobards, but it's also episodic, really. It wouldn't happen again, also because the Longobards had the upper hand. These guys were ransomed, our Longobards, by the way, right? So we know that for ransoming their lives, these people could pay 600 solidi. I don't know if you have an idea. It's an astronomical cipher, right? Where did they have all this wealth from in such a relatively peripheral context, this modest stronghold in the very extremity, like the frontier between the Longobards and Bavaria, right? Plus, we are literally told that the bishops of Trento and Sabiona, that have, by the way, Roman names, as you understand here, made, they acted as intermediaries, right? So they had a prestige, a relevance. They were considered, even in this somehow, violent frontier, evidently, and even managed to pull a deal off for these guys. Also, some years later, the same Agnellus of Trent was sent by the Longobard king Agilulf in France to ransom those who had been deported there as prisoners of war. Right, so these are, again, essentially Roman bishops in the Longobard kingdom that are used for diplomatic purposes, that are evidently part of a functional system where people even have such an abundant amount of wealth, atypically, right? But surely somebody paid for them, and so there was a wealth net that is a bit representative of this since the end of the 6th, the beginning of the 7th century, which doesn't leave much doubt about the situation of these areas. Consider also this, that northern Italy, up to this very time, had not been particularly, compared to the rest of the peninsula, had not been particularly opulent, right? As we've seen, there were big Roman cities. They were, generally speaking, quite valuable assets in the Po Valley and so on. But here we're talking about the Trento Valley in the end of the 6th century, beginning of the 7th, so you wouldn't expect it to be just the single most advanced place in the peninsula, right? So comparatively with what the Longobards already controlled, because at the time of Agilulf, of course, the kingdom was already well established. Like, the comparison is really striking, right? Admittedly, these are few examples, but they are still very telling, right? Surely not of a desperate, miserable situation, nor of essentially an eradication of, in this case, of, for example, the Roman bishops as at the head of the communities, at the head of the people, right? So we can say that the wide majority of the episcopal estate in Italy found their way to cooperate with the Longobards, and apparently without much tension in general. In Italy, just as in Gaul and in other late Roman regions, the bishops were notoriously important figures, right? They truly represented the local populations. It's a proof, the long and interesting letter sent in 591 to the Emperor Maurice by the bishops of the dioceses of northeastern Italy that were under Aquileia, regarding the very bitter religious disagreement among the churches of, in fact, the Aquileian Patriarchate and Constantinople, that would eventually turn out in the better-known schism of the three chapters. And always because the Byzantines were doing pretty shady stuff, right, in order to compromise with, with heretical movements, things like that. Now, in this letter, it's very obvious that the populations were being represented by and very close to their own bishops, even ready to recur to violence against the Byzantine imposition, right? But the most important thing of this is that these sees were, at that point, mostly under the Longobards. In other words, here you have the Byzantine emperor talking to the dioceses that were within the ecclesiastical province of Aquileia, that were under the Longobards, and that were, by following their bishops, telling that what Constantinople was doing, they didn't like at all, right? The fascinating aspect is here among these signatures in the letter, and also the one of the Synod of Marano, from which this letter started. The bishops of Verona, of Vicenza, and the aforementioned bishops of Trent, of Sabbiona, of Treviso, that thus all appear safely in their place in the lands occupied by the Longobards. Other bishops that sign, such as the one of Feltre and Asolo, of course in the same area, are not exactly known whether to be under the Longobards or the Byzantines, right? But still, right, it's a frontier dimension, and you have all these bishops and their populations acting in unison, also pretty aggressively, like telling the Byzantines that they were disagreeing with the very emperor, right, and that they would have essentially stood their ground, and most of them were under the Longobards. Well, in this sense, are not telling us anything, right? This is an ecclesiastical issue, right? There is no explicit interference, right? We can't just think here that the Longobards, with a dagger behind, the bishop signing the letter saying go against the Byzantine. And even if it had been so, which of course is pure fantasy, still the people were with their own shepherds, right? And so the ecclesiastical administration of these places was functioning without too much of a problem. Consider that this northeastern part of the country was not, let's say, was not dissonant from the government of Pavia in Neustria, but it was not even directly controlled habitually, right? We've seen as in other videos, like they acted autonomously, right? They were the local dukes, because all these cities we listed had a duke, a Longobard duke, and a Roman bishop, right, administrating the provinces, the single provinces. So here we're not even talking about the much more Romanized, by the way, cities of Milan or Pavia, that, as we've seen, maintained their own clergy and were also bigger, by the way, and that's a bit of a problem historically, that we know sometimes more about these peripheral areas than the very center of Longobard power, but the hints we get from there are also more advanced in the direction that we are describing, right? So the mediation role of the church, in spite of all the difficulties of the war between the Longobards and the Byzantines, seems to remain substantially intact, right? This institution was fundamentally not changed. And this undoubtedly represents an element of continuity. Of course, in the specific Italian reality, the bishops didn't have, for example, the same power of the Gallic ones, right? Because, as we were saying before, like in Gaul, in Spain, the Roman, say the senatorial estate that had remained, essentially the episcopal one, was taking on the character of a sort of lordship, right? This is quite evident in places like Gaul, where the surely there had been a fracture of some sort too when the Franks had taken over, etc., but were fundamentally reconfirmed in their own roles, right? What do we know about the Longobard court, by the way? Do we know about Romans working there? Well, there is actually a almost uniform Longobard nomenclature of counselors, collaborators, or courtesans between the end of the 6th and the 7th century, right? That is to say, in spite of the personal origins of these individuals, at least even someone who may have had a Roman origin was likely by then making himself pass or simply proclaiming himself, like over the generations. Of course, people could be given different names already under Germanic influence, as Longobards though, right? And that's another topic we'll discuss in another video, is how quickly the Romans began Longobards culturally. Of course, at the Longobard court, you would expect a sort of ideological compaction around, in fact, what would remain essentially Germanic institutions. But of course, Germanic institutions that spoke and wrote in Latin, right? There is an exception, however, still of this otherwise uniform Longobard onomastics. During the reign of Agilulf and Theodolinda, and also the one of their son Adalwald, so a phase that goes from 590 to 626, so it's not even a short time, during which we actually do find some Roman names among the Longobard courtier, right? And people who surely had been helping, would keep helping later, especially with the issuing of Rotary's edict, the drafting of in that case, a legal code in Latin, which of course the Longobards had never done before, And that refers, by the way, to a generally compact kingdom where every subject is intended as such on essentially on equal basis, right? Without, yes, there are let's say there are references to the Romans that, bear in mind, were still making up consistent part of the Italian population just across the border, right, in Byzantine territory. But that evidently refers to just the same Romans who had now become Longobards in a way or another, right? Now, the important aspect of this Roman presence, especially under the reign of such philo-Catholic monarchs. I mean, Agilulf was an Arian, but his wife Theodolinda was Catholic because she was Bavarian, and so it was a sort of Frankish offspring of some sort. So they had immediately, and say before the Longobards, of course, converted to Catholicism straight from paganism, mostly. And Wu notoriously was in positive terms with Gregory the Great, who was not just writing apocalyptic works about the arrival of the Longobards, for that matter, and actually cooperated dramatically with the Longobards, and affirmed a very prosperous phase here after the war against the Byzantines, the establishment properly of even in Rome, in Ravenna, of an Italic policy, right? So because the Longobard, the Byzantines were being, as you know, busy first destroying the Persians and then being overrun by the Arabs, and so the contraction of the empires was bringing to a more specifically Italian physiognomy whichever power was ruling from the peninsula. More of this later, but again, this is the time of the foundation of Bobbio in the same, the Bobbio monastery in the same, with the Celtic mission in the same Longobard Italy. There is a general sense of peace, right, of concord, right. There are no persecutions known in Longobard times against the Catholics, as we've seen. Even from onomastics, it seems that they remain there all along. Also, the thing of being Arian or Catholic is a problem that existed as long as the elites of late antiquity, even among the Germans, existed. This had been a problem among the Ostrogoths, by the way, much less than for the Vandals and the Visigoths, so that even for Italy there was a good precedent for that. But when you see these factions, right, it would remain actually at the Longobard court at some point for single dukes to become king in Pavia, in a already and firmly established, in especially universally accepted institution like the monarchic one, also territorially, were calling themselves Arian Catholic, but they had to do with, say, the name of a party, not the actual theological or religious policy content, nor, as we've seen in the list about the northeast of Italy, where, for example, Arianism lasted more than in Neustria, really suggests any form of persecution or drama or, dramatic break with pre-Longobard times at all, right? But we must obviously think that it had been the Romans who had successfully instructed the Longobards on how to administrate a place with cities, right? You give it for granted, but, if we will see this in the part about the Longobard migration, but the Longobards had never been in a place where, say, cities existed, and especially at the level of Italy, at some point, places like Vienna, in Pannonia, etc., but those had been controlled by the Longobards, but those are also some of the places in which urbanism had declined dramatically. Like, we start knowing about Vienna again with some detail only in the 12th century, right? So this is a completely different picture. The cities here do not go abandoned. This is not places like, I don't know, England or other parts of Northern Europe. This is, again, and it's been demonstrated dramatically. The settlement, administrative, demographic continuity is striking, right? Again, I know it's paradigmatically difficult to conceive the idea of a crisis, but still a place that has it compared over others. Like but this is exactly what happened, right? And just think it from the Longobards' perspective. This was a place to treasure as such, not to demolish, not to restructure according to some strange abstract plan, right? For most of the fact that the first generations, Longobards had mostly to fight to survive, and they received essentially a support from the local system. They managed to defend it successfully. They managed to instate a functional monarchy and a political territorial domination that would keep on developing on a civil and unitary basis. Again, I say it because I have the scruple that people watch my videos for the first time and they do not know the thing. Also, the concept that the Longobard kingdom was chronically, fragmented into duchies that were against one another in a sort of anarchy is complete bogus, right? This thing did not exist. In practice, not even at the very beginning, where there were some Longobards who stayed with the Byzantines and were not recognizing the monarchic institution. Right? They more or less had a clear idea that we're Longobards and that the monarchic institution was an option, and still that it was also, of course, an opportunity. And after Authority, the kingdom is recognized uniformly by all the Longobards across the entire peninsula. Where you could have a substitution of a duke or another, but no major, political crisis, separation, secession, rejection of the monarchy. This is just an incredibly superficial and, by this time, completely unacceptable opinion that they had, I think, in the 19th century. Mostly the German and the Italian nationalists, who at some point were even unaware, because certain things were discovered later, sources, studies with other methods, more evidence highlighted and so on, but it's not a thing, right? This was a concept modeled on the very, very beginning of Longobard history and the very, very end, right? But all in between, 150 years of successfully functional domination is skipped in popular culture, so that the Longobards become the memes of the bloodthirsty barbarians, etc. So this video doesn't want to go as far as saying, well, everything was like before. No, it wasn't, right? There was also a significant difference from, say, Ostrogothic times, because the Longobards didn't have a Cassiodorus as the minister of Theodoric, nor a Liberius, that is the senator that organized back in the day the Ostrogothic settlement in the peninsula through the tertia, that is to say the 1/3 of the land, of the fiscal income, by the way, so not literally 1/3 of the of the surface, let's say, inhabitable, counted as such, to the Germans, right? This was a system stemming from essentially the supply system of the army. That was the actual point. It was an unknown, and it was a canon, fundamentally, that was levied from the latifundia. It was paid in that kind of centralized fashion through the senators who owned that stuff. And 1/3 of it was given to, in that case, the Ostrogoths, to make up the army, fundamentally. And Italy had been ruled, again, continuously the Roman way, because there was also not any other way to rule it in the first place, nor the Ostrogoths had any interest to change it in any other way, at least as long as those powerful structures were standing. The problem was rather who controlled them, and the fact that it was a thalassocratic power like Constantinople that was always looming on the land, trying to take it back, right? With, as we've seen, a senatorial elite that somehow was hoping that to happen in a way or another. So, of course, the Longobard way of rule was different from what the Ostrogothic one had been. There had also been very different peoples, but I will not digress here on the differences. We could make another video on them. And this is the point like you can make regarding the fracture, which is mostly institutional in form, right? The Longobard settlement surely caused a change with the previous public structures, right? Not to a substantial extent, but to a formal one, right? The Longobard kingdom was a new thing. Technically, the Ostrogoths were just ruling in Italy as federati, in a Roman land, right? So it was a very different thing. And likely, again, the Longobards, as we will see now, were settled by the Byzantines, more or less in the same way. Or actually in the very same way, except things got out of hand, right? And considered that there was no other way to known, right, for settling the barbarians in the West. I mean, every single Germanic people that had been settled everywhere, in Gaul, in Spain, in Africa, in Italy, in the same way, right? It was just the norm. It was the most obvious functional way. It was not about, okay, let's make up a new way to do it. Like it gets down to very simple essentials, right? It's about the subdivision of the rents / the fiscal rents. That's it, right? And we think that even though we do not, like you see, the Longobards eventually found the kingdom for good in the 80s, let's say, of the 6th century, and that we do not know about those early times. The administrative documents, whatever, are lost. But as we do not really see much trouble, as we were just saying, we just think that more or less at least the same amount of, say, the same output that was collected by the Byzantines before the Longobard invasion was now subsumed by the Germans in different ways. As we were saying before, the main difference is that in Justinian's times, Italy is just, doesn't matter how important Rome is, it's the literal center of the empire, spiritually, universally, metaphysically. That's one thing. But Italy as such is just a peripheral, provincial land that you have to squeeze because you're trying to survive in the East in some other way, right? At this point, and at that point, you still need that way of collecting, harvesting that wealth and bringing it somewhere else. We know that the Italian cities, like the others of the empire, had to provide with a specific amount of gold, right, and a lot of, to send to Constantinople. This is a true tribute, right? With the Longobards, we obviously see that, given that they weren't going anywhere, that same wealth had to remain there and served for the development of the Italian kingdom, not for some external endeavor, right? So that's also the reason why the situation stabilized so soon, and there was no reason even to document, to reorganize according to some master plan. Everything followed smoothly. The Longobards settled. They had this ducal fashion. They essentially ruled from the various cities that corresponded to the duchies. That's it. It's a local signory. And then there is a monarchy that grabs some of this wealth. And it was also the initial object of content between the monarch and the dukes, right? But that's how the kingdom was factually founded. Right? That's what it means, the kingdom to be founded. because it was a territorial institution now, something that the Longobards had never had before. They could have a leader that would guide them into this, again, fantastic south, exciting the conquest fantasies of the Germanic warriors from Central Europe. But now it was another thing, and this is very clear. We will see it well when we get to the Edictum Rothari, hopefully soon. That's the reason why, let's say, the Roman fiscus ended, but not necessarily the way to, say, administrate the single places really changed. If anything, now it seems that the wealth was much more locally concentrated. So it was positive, because instead of, say, owing this wealth to someone that also lives very far away, you can owe it to the local Longobard duke that, however, lives in your freaking city, in the local palaces, that makes war to defend your own territory, that is populated by you, who works for this system to survive. It's your system, it's your home, it's your province, right? This is incredibly important, right? The Italian campanalism, so-called, this sense of municipal pride, and also, of competition, of conflict with the neighbors, was something already existing. Saying in Roman times, the Roman municipia were incredibly proud of their own accomplishments, of their own status, right? The other thing we will have to see here now is that hardly especially this citizenry, would have lost their own freedom. The Longobards may have initially considered them as subjects, so as a B series compared to the Germans, but there's no evidence that this actually meant practically much, aside from the fact that everybody became Longobard in a few generations, and probably exactly and paradoxically in the most Romanized areas, right, where the Roman influence was stronger and the Longobards were relatively more easygoing, to make these guys becoming as Longobards as them juridically. I'm also prone to believe that while Narses' story, the fact that he being jealous of Justinian, just like Belisarius would have been as a threat to the Byzantine throne, etc., would have called the Longobards as a sort of gotcha-like revenge. Actually, the Longobards were settled by the Byzantines by some other agreement. Now, Narses probably has nothing to do with this, even if surely he had contact with the Longobards. He actually had them in his own army against the Ostrogoths during the war, and actually he got himself rid of them because they were apparently very turbulent, but surely he was the one deputed to the major international relations. Surely Constantinople had some, because Pannonia is not that far away technically. They arrived essentially to the Danube, even up to places like Singidunum, etc. There were the Gepids to knock out, etc. But it's obvious that the guy did not do anything against Justinian, because Narses simply had state funerals in Constantinople, which you do not give to a traitor of the empire, right? Who called the Longobards just for some shady revenge against Justinian. Right, the thing was surely managed, because you see, when the Longobards entered Italy, the purpose was surely to keep them in the Po Valley as a buffer state against the Merovingians, which largely was also the reason why Justinian carried out the reconquest of the West, among the others, of course, but the Atlantic perspective, one of checking Frankish expansion in the Mediterranean, as would have objectively revived, in fact, in the same Italy in the 8th century, was a huge deal, right? And when the Longobards settle, look at Byzantine history, Byzantine sources, nothing is happening. Like in Constantinople, everything is fine. Nobody is talking war. Nobody is putting together an army to send to Italy. There is no field army there. So surely everything was planned, right? We could easily say that, even if we do not have any evidence, because otherwise politically, strategically, it wouldn't make any sense, right? And in any case, this does mean that there were some Roman way of settling the Longobards conceived at the beginning, right? In Longobard times, we do not see the survival of the Roman fiscus in the law, in administration. There's no trace of that, right? But we do not have to exclude that this is how it worked in a first time, and that eventually, again, given especially this way the Longobards seized their own land autonomously, this simply got down to, okay, let's rule from the cities as individual dukes, and then let's give something to the king, because that's what they did. It was exactly given part of the income to the king, even some parts of land where the gasolds would be installed to check the ducal work, right, as essentially as if every subject could appeal to the king for any abuse or something like that. So the hospitalitas surely had to do with directly or indirectly the way the Longobards initially acquired their own income. The amount of land for settlement was surely available because of the general depopulation of the peninsula. The fact that the Longobards, there is some difference the way the Longobards and the Ostrogoths settled, because the latter were basically scattered mostly in the north and in the Apennines, so in the strategic areas that had also less population and cities, because that were there, of course, there were important cities in these very locations, but they were more peripheral. They didn't want to just show the Germans in the midst of very highly Romanized places, right? They were the soldiers, after all, and it was like for someone coming from the Balkans in the 5th century, a huge deal in the first place to be settled in places like the Apennine or the Prealpine valleys, right? So there is not a problem. The Longobards come in a bit more prepotently, as we've seen, but they do also settle in such places. Also because if you wanted to threaten the Byzantine control from of the rest of the peninsula, you must, as the Longobards would succeed in by essentially gaining the upper hand by the beginning of the 7th century, you must control them. Right, so we will see it in another video about the actual settlement, in which places, for example, we see even a greater genetic influence, right? There are places that admittedly were settled always by these northern invaders, the Italics, the Goths, the Longobards. I mean, historically, they all settled. They came from Central Europe. This was a thing going on from Indo-European migrations and settling mostly along the Apennine. Yet the forms of settlement of the Longobards were evidently Roman. Why? Because the cities were Roman. Because the wide majority, like we're talking the Longobards, like compared to the entire Italian peninsula, like something like from 1 to 3% of the population. Admittedly, half of it was controlled by the Byzantines, but the majority of the people lived in the Italic hinterland, not much in the Byzantine kind of coastal places. And still it was a proximity, as we'll see now, also culturally, with the models of administration. But let's say a Longobard king that in the late 6th century could still participate could still assist to the races in the Circus of Milan, like a Roman emperor, right? Surely wasn't installing himself in there as, okay, now we bring, tribalism to rule this place. It was evidently walking on the same steps of the, generally speaking, what the Roman system was providing them with, because that's why they were there in the first place, to their own advantage, by the way. And the success of the Longobard kingdom in general is, again, a testament to this. And specifically, the Longobards, just like any other German, right? We could make a different case for the nomads, right? The Huns, for example, didn't have the cultural tools to rule the Roman Empire, right? They were just, first of all, very overrated in a sense, but also quite primitive. They had to stay out of it to milk it in a way. The Longobards instead surely made their best to make the Roman statal machine and society survive, obviously for enjoying its fruits, right? This is particularly important. So when we look at, say, the Longobards arrived, everything changed. What proof do we have? What's the jump there, right? The fact that Eurasia was dramatically contracting demographically and economically. Yes, but what does this have to do with the Longobards, and why would the Longobards like this or cause it to Italy? Right, war again in the frontier areas is another story. Here we're talking about the core land, the ones from which they would successfully also take over the others that still were, for early medieval standards, in spite of all these devastations, again, particularly advanced, if not some of the most advanced in absolute terms. So the question here is that the heavily negative trend that is international situation presents has nothing to do with any Longobard damage, especially inflicted by an alleged and just nonsensical, blind, destructive fury. Right. Furthermore, the Longobards did find in Italy a functioning fiscal administration. In particular, in the areas that had been held by the Byzantines for a longer time. So it's absurd that they didn't even try to serve themselves with what was still standing and offered very good opportunities of exploitation. This is obvious, right? So think all these data through the cliche again. With the Longobards, it was a total fracture, man. It's late antiquity dies. This place changes forever. The Longobards, what, where, how? Right? You must explain this, and this notoriously is not documented, which may, of course, speak for the general decline, but not for the fact that, of course, what is not documented, which doesn't mean that did not exist either, and that was obviously Roman, right? As this land would fundamentally remain, whether they called themselves Longobards at a point, but evidently so. Paul the Deacon defines, by the way, the Longobards as hospites, right? So he writes, he uses, by the way, this terms accompanied by the explanation that the Longobards split the population in a way so that they had to pay them 1/3 of the fruits, that is, of the land, etc. So Paul the Deacon in the 8th century is actually using an ancient vocabulary filled with Roman technical terms, still in the 8th century, still after essentially centuries of Longobard domination. And he was a Longobard too, right, that wrote in Latin still, and echoed these terminologies. Naturally, from Paul the Deacon's work, we cannot, of course, interpret in a too strictly technical term what this settlement occurred like, right? But it's evident that he's referring to a mechanism of late Roman hospitalitas that had remained as part of the Longobard historical memory, because it had been used at the beginning, right? The Longobards settle again in this wide areas that were in part inhabited, it is true, but some were properly abandoned by the same greater owners that had, and that still namely controlled them. This is an interesting part that people often don't reflect on. So there wasn't, first of all, much of a difficulty in settling the Longobards in the first place. Again, this is a populated land, but it's also populated for late antique, now early medieval standards. So this means that there is still a lot of land out there. There would be some considerations to do about the connections between the Roman cities and the countryside population, specifically in Italy, because this would be significantly different even throughout the entire Middle Ages compared, say, to France or Germany. In other words, the Italian countryside was always connected directly to the city, to the world of the city. Like the world of the forest, in a sense of like a community, was completely cut out of the rest, right, of the system. Did not exist here, right? There were, of course, communities inhabiting more peripheral areas, etc. But the entire social mechanism revolved around the city as well. And this is actually an indicator of advancement, right? There was actually even a literacy at some point in the medieval Italian countryside that didn't find any comparison in the rest of Europe, etc. The main areas still, let's say, occupied by the Byzantines are in northeast Liguria, central Italy, southern Italy, the islands, right? And in part, as we will see, these people will move into Longobard territory, not en masse, but there is substantial evidence of this, and still the same Longobard settlement preceded them in that regard. As I was saying before, the continental Italic dimension that is also the prevalent, the Romance one, is the Longobards, just culturally, just again, the Latin Germanic side is something very different from the Greek Byzantine one. And there are probably two different areas. Just like, because this is how the Byzantines had worked, and mostly on an Hellenic prior basis. Just the coasts, basically the main cities along the coasts. Right, the Longobards now were controlling the outer, like the hinterland, but from a place that, unlike the rest of the Byzantine hinterland, was Romanized, meaning colonized heavily by millennium of Roman history, differently from, doesn't matter how much the Romans could do in the East, but in fact from the Byzantine Empire, meaning that, Gaul, Spain began to talk Romance at some point, even though they didn't have anything to do with that. In the Byzantine world, you mostly have an Hellenic influence, right? The Romans did colonize certain places, but the prevalent was Hellenic. Right? So the Longobards here fit another world that is fundamentally the Romanized hinterland that is not the Byzantine hinterland. This is incredibly important to picture, because if you still confuse the Romanity as a sort of monolithic block for essentially a sort of ethnic war against other, that it's not going to work. You're basically going to miss the single most important chunk of this story, because it's literally the basis on which the same Longobard institution was founded, as a royally speaking. And Gregory the Great, in his letters, gives us very important information regarding the role that the Longobards had as federati, so indirectly telling us how many of them saw themselves as being settled, in fact, according to the Roman fashion. For example, the Duke of Spoleto-Ariulf, I made a video about the Duchy of Spoleto some weeks ago, is presented by Gregory the Great as a federatus of the empire. Even if often a rebel one, the Longobards of Spoleto are a bit the exception that confirms the rule of an otherwise obedience to the kingdom. In this case, they were being disobedient to the Romans, but meaning that they mostly sided with them as opposed to Pavia as such, but also because they were really in the heart of the Apennine, so it was just a peculiar location in the first place that could allow them to do so. And in one instance, the Pope tells us that the Duke, Ariulf, had asked the same Pope for the payment of a salary to the warriors of two Longobard chiefs that had just passed into his service, and that had always had previously been from the imperial side. Now, this aspect is fascinating because from one side you have this movement of war bands that evidently were. These are the years in which the Longobards are, say, the kingdom is claiming back the territory of those dukes who are still from the side of the Byzantines, right? And so there is still a lot of movement around. And then you have this mixed allegiance, for which this guy doesn't ask for the salary to, say, the Exarch or Constantinople. He asks it to the Pope. And Gregory the Great was really frank about this when he was admonishing the Byzantine emperor that if he had wanted, he could have turned Italy entirely against him. Because the Longobards were just like considered the first thing Theodoric did after Ravenna fell was to pay homage to the Pope in Rome. Right? The Longobards here were a bit different because they were Arians, but they were also fighting against the Byzantines in that instance. So the Pope still counted as the Duchy of Rome as an enemy. Right, so it was a slightly different situation. But in this case, you find the Duke of Spoleto, by the way, is, as we've seen, very close to Rome. Right, so there is an historical, say, syntony or some sort of love-hate story, right? Because it's just across the Apennine, and that's what the Duke of Spoleto controlled in terms of the passes and so on. So, again, I discussed this in the medieval. The Duchy of Spoleto video, right? So this was another way, by the way, for Ariulf to ask the peace for price. That is to say, if you give me a salary, so if you, as say, still the Roman state by some degree, or even as the vicar of Christ on earth, you pay for the salary of these war bands, I will control them. And these guys had already been from the imperial side, so I warn you that they could switch the allegiance in this regard. But if you pay, right, I will control. If you pay for them, for their service, I will control them, and I will make them turn against you. I will not make them commit raids or sacks. Remember, that was an enemy, right? The Duchy of Rome would have counted as one of the targets of Longobard raids. That's where things could get messy, such as with the first destruction of the Abbey of Monte Cassino. It was at the hand of the Longobards themselves, and the Pope said literally, they destroyed our monastery, because that had also a very strong connection with Rome, with the Gregorian policy of winning over, also through the Benedictine formula, like the countryside, the peasantry of Europe in this quite hard times. There's no doubt about that either, right? So, on the basis of such Ariulf's request, right, we could wonder how many other Longobard leaders asked the Byzantine neighbors of some sort for a tribute, like to avoid essentially launching this war bands in their territory, right? Besides Ariulf, also the dukes Arichis of Benevent and Gisulf of Friuli, Chilane of Tuscany, and other Longobard leaders appear in different moments as imperial federati, and thus presumably maintained through such payments, salaries from the Byzantine side. This is also fascinating because ultimately they would all, as we were saying before, all these territories will be part of the Longobard kingdom quite soon, like in the moment in which was founded. These were Longobard powers that recognized the monarch of Pavia. Right, so in this, we're talking about the very early phase here, this very end of the 6th century, right? So surely, by the way, the aforementioned salaries were extracted by the taxes still paid by the Roman populations. Right, both the Longobards and the Byzantines there were collecting taxes. Right, so this would be a further hint of the fact that the Longobards knew, at least very closely, the functioning of the Roman fiscal system, because they were asking for that money themselves, as they probably had been already endowed, like as far as the settlement wherever as federati had entailed. Right, so this strengthens the idea that what eventually the Longobards governed like is not, let's say, a revolutionary method. They had to get the income from somewhere, so they didn't make discounts, likely. But as we have observed before, from a political point of view, it makes a lot of difference whether you're using this for a local government or for somebody that lives pretty far away, such as the Bosphorus. Right, so this wealth stabilized their power locally. So we can't say technically that the Roman fiscus was simply lost. Right, it wasn't. Surely here, as we'll see now, there are some implications of this statement. We will see them more accurately, but the way you govern a place in the 6th century does not vary, like especially in a sedentary context particularly, right? Unless there is not, again, a disaster situation from which you can draw less than before, things like that, but the means are practically the same. You can call them as you like, but it's essentially agricultural output. It's essentially the peasantry breaking their backs in the fields. Right, that's how the world works. There's not, let's say, alternative lifestyles except the nomadic ones. That is to try to loot this harvests. That's it. That's what the Byzantines and the Longobards did against one another, to some degree. Still, Gregory the Great informs us that some Roman landowners of the island of Corsica fled to the Longobards, exactly to essentially evade the heavy taxes. Right. So the concept again that there may have been still, again, a Byzantine power knocking at the door was, in my opinion, the thing, not much what kind of instrument we're using to levy the taxes. Right. So this makes sense. By the way, Corsica will, at some point, which is unknown, but we get it when the fait is accompli, passed to the Longobards, or at least the Longobards seized it, and was heavily connected with Tuscany, and the sources of Longobard Italy do not speak of the burden of the taxes. Consider that Gregory of Tours speaks of this instead a lot for the neighboring Frankish kingdom. So you can't even say, oh my god, this is a Roman thing. Now this has to do with the structure of the system. It has to do with who rules how, with which level of political and social leverage. Right? This is the thing. In Gaul, of course, there were still very few people who controlled the entirety of the land. Right? That's how the Merovingians built their own power. That's why they still had also kind of an imperial drive. Right? So the fact that there were some communities that said, we do not want to pay taxes because there is an overlord who decides so. And this stuff doesn't get down, is not used by us. Right? It makes a lot of sense. Right, so it's a very meaningful distinction that doesn't have to do with the Romans or the Germans, if not just in the sense that, of course, whenever the Germans seized the Roman latifundia, they began to rule them in that way. Right, in Italy, the latifundium had gone basically not destroyed physically, but subdivided. During the same Gothic War, where the Goths had promised full freedom to the colonists, right, to the serfs, if they had fought with them, right, and because, of course, and this is the point that would make us believe this, is that the Italian populace, by the point of the Longobard migration, had had it enough of the Byzantines and preferred, negotiated in a way that the obedience, the cooperation, the support of the Longobards, right, as an alternative to this oppressive system. And this makes a lot of sense, because at least, again, probably the pressure of the exactions is debatable. We do not have measurable data. But it's obvious that you're going to be more content if you pay for, say, fortifying your own walls than a place thousands of kilometers away. Because you actually see where that wealth goes. And so it's still your place, right? And always remember, again, the nature of the Italic interland, of Roman urbanization, and what being in one of these cities, seats of duchies and dioceses, actually meant in the community organization. We have seen it before, with those bishops complaining against Constantinople. Right, that is, in my opinion, the reflection of this phenomenon. Consider that there was surely also a variation of local conditions, because the Longobard conquest was in some places more orderly, such as in the Po Valley, and as we've seen in central Italy, more turbulent and slower, by the way, and protracted over time. So this also determined the forms of, not the forms of government, but let's say the dynamics, the way the local balance was at the time of the conquest, etc. The Longobards surely were aided by the fact that a substantial amount of land was available at the time of the invasion. The one of the Roman fiscus, first of all, the one of the episcopal churches, at least the ones, as we've seen, with those, those with which they had not reached an agreement, right? And this aspect is fascinating because we know that there were confiscations of ecclesiastical land that was, however, rendered back to the bishops only by Agilulf 30 years later. We do not know in which measure. If we see the clergy, if we see the same diocese, we know, generally speaking, of their presence, their activity, etc., we understand that this were not like, say, radical confiscations. There was some land was essentially taken, surely by acts of force, right? But it was, again, always the land of the church, and as we've seen, the Longobards didn't have any specific reason to become enemy with essentially the most important institution, which would represent the local population, right? So this occurred in different only in those circumstances in which an agreement was not reached, and in any case, this land was evidently, for the mere fact it was rendered back at some point, had been owned by institutions who had still the strength to get it back over time after the Longobard establishment of the kingdom. So they're not passive actors, right, in the whole thing. Then we have seen those landowners who had been killed or had fled, had gone far away, right? Because this could happen in any case. And there is finally that category of the great landowners who had not died nor they had escaped, but they simply resided elsewhere, perhaps in the same Byzantine Italy. This is a very important and overlooked aspect. First of all, consider that the senatorial elite owned land all over the peninsula. Right? Say you were a Campanian landowner, and you had land, I don't know, in the north, on the Adriatic as well. There were enormous amounts of land scattered. Even in other provinces, you could have land in Africa. Even if you were based in Italy, it was absolutely normal, right? So that by moving to another place, say because the Longobards were arriving, it was still Italy, you still had essentially some land that you had left behind, or that maybe just because you already lived somewhere else was taken by the Longobards, but you were still in Italy somewhere and you couldn't do much about that. So let's leave aside the considerations we will see of, say, attempted Byzantine counterattack against the Longobards to take them out, or something like that. That surely had to do also with these landowners trying to recover their property. But we have an extraordinary document, actually multiple ones, that are Ravenna's papyri. Right, these are Ravenna, as you know, was the capital of the Exarchate. Basically, the entire peninsular Italy, the Byzantine peninsular Italy, depended on it. It was the gate of to the east, to Constantinople, because of the port on the Adriatic, etc. So the Byzantine Italian administration was there, and we have, fortunately, thanks to this level of centralization, some documents that show us very well, by the way, how before the Longobard invasion, on the eve, let's say, of Longobard invasion, the phenomenon of the absent landowners, that is, that lived far away from their lands, simply collecting the rents, right, that were subdivided, sold, or donated, because some of these people literally disappeared. Some went living to Constantinople. I mean, during the Gothic War, they died or they fled elsewhere. So, the problem in Italy was very evident because, to a degree, they didn't even know whom to give this land precisely, because the local administrators surely would take control, but in theory, these lands belonged to someone. And it was evidently very complicated in the 6th, the 7th century, like, especially in these first times in which there was an open war with the Longobards, how to, say, whom to give them back. I mean, there were people who had their rights on it, but even the accessibility to them was quite complicated, and still that was land, also workable land, inhabited land, because the colonists that inhabited those places remained there, as we've seen, largely. And when the Longobards arrived, such situations had to surely resolve itself in a loss of those lands. Because imagine, again, this land is nobody's, or at least it's someone's that is a Byzantine, right, that lives somewhere else, and that is so belonging to an empire that is making actively war with you. You simply take that land, right? It's actually pretty easy to do, and together with the people who work there, because more than the land, it's the people that matter. Again, we are in the early Middle Ages. Demographic resources is very important. Having people, you can have a lot of land, but if you don't have people to work it, you do not gain anything from it. So from such quantity of land, that could be, by the way, public or private alike, a rich agricultural surplus could be extracted in a form of rent or tax, right? So in either way, the direct exploitation from the side of the Longobards of the Italian lands, with or without the work of dependent peasants, by the way, because we will see this is also important, like what did happen to these people, right? And by which degree did they already consider that land their own, for example, which is fascinating. That is, in any case, given that everybody would become Longobard here, the birth of a Longobard landed asset had to be a rather fast process, because again, there wasn't much of a change in the relations, in the inhabitants, in this stuff. Like if even a place was depopulated, it would simply take it and possibly repopulate it with other people as well. So no trauma, really. There may have been a different card mix, but at the end of the day, everything was with the same forces entailed, actually, even with the Longobard new ones injected. Because the Longobards, as we've seen, were a staunch minority numerically, but they were also, in absolute terms, the largest migration of the era. We're talking something between 100, some say less, but I believe it was something between 100 and 300,000, right? And just, let's say, like, of course, a minority of these were warriors, by the way. So our people could be settled, working. They weren't just freemen, by the way. So this would be very interesting to observe. We will see it in other videos about Longobard society. I made a video already about the passage from serfs to massari that took place in Longobard, Italy. So generally speaking, whichever the conditions of the local peasants were, they generally speaking improved in Longobard times, in relative, also in absolute terms, telling you the truth. So this also for the people who want to make this fracture ever more catastrophic in the sense of, oh my god, the Roman Empire ended, so everything went worse than it was before. Well, not really. I think it's an incredibly ignorant and superficial statement on the basis of what we know about medieval history, and not because it's medieval, which of course never existed as such, but because we're talking about places that, again, continued greatly what was the prior situation that we needed instead to dramatize and to make a tragedy of, because we either are sort of Roman or Germanic fanboys of some sort. That's not history, right? Just to be pretty blunt about it. So, what did we see in this video? Obviously, that the picture was not thrown upside down. After many decades of war, there was a lot of land. The social frame of the countryside was not substantially altered by the Longobard settlement. And the circumstances in which this land was materially distributed to the Longobard warriors and the quantity surely pretty vast one of it that remained in the hands of the dukes and eventually of the kings, we cannot define. It is certain, however, that this was the principal base of maintenance of the Longobards since the first time, as it's also clear that the amount of land was not individual. The amount of land held, for example, by the king or by even the dukes was not so big compared to, say, what's happening in Gaul, right? Where, again, very few people owned a lot of land. Even a Norman magnate in Merovingian time had sometimes a larger amount of land than the Longobard king. Right? The Longobard kingdom was mostly based on such, say, wealth distribution, in the sense that it worked in a cooperative sense from all these elements, and surprisingly enough, it did work pretty well because they had an idea of how convenient this land was to be administered in such a way. And to the general compaction of the land, by the way. So this is not a negative thing at all, right? Part of the fiscus was still living, right, in a form of direct appropriation through the hospitalitas. That, as we've seen, is what Paul the Deacon, on the base of Secundus of Non, actually says. This had even began for those Longobards who had settled as Byzantine federati and thus maintaining relation with the empire for a while, as payment from the same Constantinople, interestingly enough. Maybe not directly from Constantinople, of course, but there are instances even of Longobard warriors that went fighting in the Balkans or in the Caucasus, and there were even generals, and one is buried in Ravenna, for example. So this was a guy, was a Swabian, by the way, was adopted by the Longobards and then switched side to the Byzantines, and he was a very successful commander, and he was, however, in that sense, Italian. He decided to come back home, and surely he was being paid by the imperial administration, and he died there, and he had land there, in Ravenna or wherever, in Byzantine Italy. And who knows whether, well, probably not, but surely he had personal contacts with Italy, with Longobard Italy, which had been its home for life, and they were relatively short distances, right? So these aspects are really fascinating, right? We see Gregory the Great telling us pretty candidly that these Longobard chiefs simply asked the empire for payment just to be on their side, and even not just to the empire, in that case to the Pope himself, which was consistently rich, had a militia on its own aside from the Byzantine garrison. So this is fascinating. I made videos, by the way, on how the Byzantines were affected by this. How they militarized the Italic communities themselves. Like, there wasn't this enormous difference between Longobard Italy and Byzantine Italy. Right, there were significant differences, but they were the same country, in fact. So, again, if you want to stress the fracture, you should think of two parallel realities, one the opposite of the other, incredibly unbalanced, just on the basis that one was Germanic and another was Byzantine. Well, that's not how it worked, right? So, with the decades passing, the fiscal mechanism was, however, losing its meaning, because at that point it was easier to receive wealth, like from, say, just the consolidation of local power, right? There was surely a time in which the Longobards settled in Italy and said, but maybe the Byzantines will wipe us out, I mean, they risked that. It was a joint invasion with the Franks and the Byzantines on multiple occasions, but Longobards managed to pull it off. But it was a precarious situation. So think about that, because we know how it went, but they didn't know how it would go, right? So even the ways they interacted and were dependent on this kind of general risk and instability that had to make them aware about what was going on. However, these taxes disappeared or transformed themselves in rents that were collected by the great landowners, and the final and silent disappearance of the fiscus surely does not oppose in favor of a great relevance, even in the time in which it was still working, as we've seen. Now, we will surely appreciate these aspects further, because these are just videos about the Longobard settlement, but there is also the matter of the foundation of the kingdoms that entailed other relations, other mechanisms, and so on. We will see them in another time, but hopefully this was useful, right, to introduce to that as well. And so remember that we're talking the 6th century. Like, it's banal how people today think that changes are very slow, but for the times like the 6th century, some of the least, say, prosper and developed with very short surplus, less people, we have to think that suddenly there were systematically, cataclysmically traumatic, categorical differences between one place and another. Right? This actually is one of the greatest forms of cultural manifestations of cultural disorientation, historical illiteracy, and general sense that people fundamentally get interested only in the simplest things that are admittedly, as we've seen, complex, but that can barely compare with the much more complex ones, even of other times. This is probably the reason why I get so many views when I make a migration era video. But of course, if I talk about the late Roman, say the late medieval times, or early modern history, like, it's not so fun. There are other reasons for that too, which are not that positive either. But I suspect that it has a lot to do with this somehow simplistic, cheap, and frankly lazy mood that we simply witness in the world. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.